Welcome to Medical Myths, Legends, and Fairytales. I'm your host, Dr. Alan Christianson. Look, you know that between the latest online fads and the crazy media headlines, it's easier than ever to get confused about your health. And you and I just want to feel better and live longer. We want to know what works. And we can't wait for further studies. We need to make decisions today based on the best evidence we've got. Well, that's exactly what this show is here for. So let's get to it. Hey, Dr. C here with you. This is a special episode of Medical Myths, Legends, and Fairytales. I spoke to a woman named Marta a few weeks ago, and she shared her story about how, a lot of the common thyroid approaches just about killed her. She had to go to the ER a couple of times. Barely made it. It was really bad. I wanted to share her story, and she was grateful and eager to do so because I find that so many people are stuck under the same misinformation. You know, the conventional world can do a poor job really helping to understand people's needs and get them to where they're feeling better. But sometimes the natural world is not safe. And this is a story that I really want others to hear and be aware of because this might be you. All right, please enjoy this very special interview, and thanks to Marta for opening up and sharing this with us. Hey, Dr. Alan Christianson here. Welcome back to another episode of Medical Myths, Legends, and Fairytales. This is a really special episode. I'm here with Marta. She and I talked a little while ago, and she had a story that I thought was really going to be compelling. And she was generous enough to share this with us and just about what a big deal thyroid treatment can be, and how important it is to get it right and how it can be dangerous if not. So, Marta, if you wouldn't mind, just let's take your story from the top. And how did you first come to be on thyroid treatment?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. C. Thank you for having me, by the way. And I hope this does help people when they hear it. So I was 22. I was a young thing just out of university, just kind of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and really excited for life to begin. And I went on a 2-week vacation with some friends. We went skiing. And during the 2 weeks that we were away, something weird started to happen, but I was not deeply acquainted with health at that point, or I guess some of the changes that would be happening in my body when something like this happened. By this, I mean thyroid. And I hope this isn't too graphic, but
You're fine.
in the 2-week period, okay, in the 2-week period, about 3 days to the bathroom. I just didn't go for probably 10 days, number 2. And in the process, I broke out. My skin, I never had acne of any sort, but it just completely broke out. My hair started falling out. For the first time in my life, I experienced an excruciating menstrual cycle. And by the time I had returned from that vacation, I had gained 15 pounds.
Wow.
And I was so confused. Obviously, how do you go on vacation and come back in that state? So I think it was because I had some friends who were in bodybuilding, and they talked about the thyroid that I was kind of maybe somewhere in my subconscious, it was hanging around, and like I understood kind of what the thyroid did. I took myself to the doctor and I asked him to check out my thyroid. I told him everything that had happened, and when the
Real
test
bad
came
constipation, random severe weight gain, horrible menstrual cycles, sudden hair loss. A lot of really strong hallmark symptoms. Yeah,
exactly. So the test returned, confirmed that it was a hypothyroid, and he put me on medication. At that point, I was on Synthroid, and but I continued to gain weight as they titrated my medication. But somehow on Synthroid, it just didn't work out for me. And I ended up going to see a naturopath, and he suggested that I go on naturally desiccated thyroid, the pig gland hormone. And I did, and I've successfully, but you'll hear not so successfully towards the last few years, been on that pig replacement hormone. And
Was there any benefit from the levothyroxine at first? I should back up a step further. Did they say how far along you were? Like how bad things were, what stage you were at, or?
No, that conversation never happened. And I
Okay.
don't know if we want to get into this, but I think a lot of my spoonies will agree. The people with autoimmune disorders will agree that the medical industry, the allopathic medical industry, leaves something to be desired. Um,
Sure.
Definitely felt that there was this sort of lack of understanding and compassion for my doctor in the little amount of information that he expressed. So
No
there
clear
was
diagnosis, nor what to expect, no why is this
the
happening, or
diagnosis. The diagnosis was, and as far as that you have hypothyroid, but it began and ended just with that. There were no expectations. How do you take care of yourself in a sort of preventative lifestyle approach? There was none of that.
could you explain the spoonie concept? I saw that in your I hadn't heard that before. I looked it up. I think I've got an idea, but I think it's a useful thing to know about and a helpful context to have.
Yeah, and I love to give attribution where I can. So unfortunately here, I don't think I can. I think it's a famous autoimmune blogger who wrote about this concept of people with autoimmune disorders. And I'm not sure if hers is hormonal or not, but we have a limited amount, a smaller amount of spoons. Like we all get spoons of energy. She was making an analogy. You would get a certain amount of spoons per day. I get a certain amount of spoons per day. But a small number, or not necessarily a small number, but a certain number of my spoons are spent on managing pain, whether it's cognitively or physically. So I think it's just speaking to the point that our capacity shrinks to do a lot of things and to achieve a lot of things. It shrinks. So
You're managing
yeah,
your
it's
resources
a term.
carefully. And
Yes. Yeah.
yeah. So at first, was there any level of benefit from that initial treatment? Clearly, it wasn't a win, but was there some help, or just none whatsoever, or maybe or even things worse in some way? Like, what was your experience with that first stage?
With the first stage, I think it didn't meet my expectations because I continued on and I continued digging. So whether the success wasn't there or my expectations weren't met, I'm not quite sure, but I certainly was not thriving. I
Sure.
was definitely surviving. My hair still continued to fall out. There was a period before I was put on medication where I suffered from depression. Like I just couldn't get out of bed for 2 weeks straight, and I just kept going my cycle looked like this: go to the fridge, get some fruits, take the fruits to the bed, eat them in bed, and sleep. I had no energy. I couldn't get out of bed. And that kind of dissipated, but it didn't fully resolve itself. So it certainly wasn't like I went on this medication and life was back to normal. There were so many gaps, and I didn't want to accept that.
Yeah. So you sought out other options, ended up on desiccated thyroid, and that was the next stage you were discussing then. Yeah.
Yeah, so quite successfully, I was on desiccated thyroid. I like if we define what success means, I definitely didn't have depression anymore. My hair stopped falling out. I could never quite get a hang of how to manage my weight though, ever. And I attribute that now. I say now that I was just playing by the wrong rules. We have all of this information on the internet, and we search and we find this information. Most of the information out there is not necessarily for somebody with a thyroid condition. So I just say that I was playing by the wrong rules. Eventually I found a way, but it's still a challenge.
With medication, it did sound like it didn't really help the weight. Was the weight still coming up, or did you plateau? Or
I plateaued, and I think the initial swelling, like I think I got up to I'm 5'5.5", and my comfortable weight is 130 pounds. I got up to 170.
wow,
Uh, and it seemed like a lot of it was maybe puffiness and water weight and swelling. And correct me if I'm wrong, from what I'm understanding about thyroid is that electrolyte management is a challenge when you have a thyroid problem.
yeah. So there's fluid retention happens when thyroid levels are
Yeah.
off for sure. Yeah. So And we're getting to the parts that are now moving closer to what's the more central part of the discussion. So you were on the desiccated, still not totally great. Other changes ensued. How were the next things that played out? How did the next steps unfold?
Yeah, so so it was about a 10-year period that I was on the desiccated thyroid, and that was all okay until, so I had a brain injury 4 years ago. And during that brain injury, I guess I guess some things changed as well, because there's a relationship with the brain and all that. But to kind of put it in a nutshell, my thyroid, my TSH started dipping. So I don't know if I can make this assertion, but my thyroid maybe could have been improving.
Sure.
And so I guess I have to go back and fill some context in. I
Please.
had struggled so much with the medical industry because I never felt like I was meeting the outcomes that I wanted. So I ended up seeking help, like I said, outside of the medical industry, but I should say the allopathic medical industry. So I did. I saw naturopaths and colonic irrigation specialists and like holistic practitioners and whatnot. And I started to come upon this information that everybody was kind of towing the line for, which was that you don't dose your thyroid by the TSH, you dose it by the T3, by the active hormone. And I had bought into that myth, to that mistruth, like a hook, line, and sinker. I was just an advocate because I mean, I was suffering, and this seemed to be the answer to my problems. And a lot of medical professionals, even in the natural world, not in the allopathic world, not in Western medicine, but in the naturopathic world, they're proponents of this. I've
Sure.
seen this information, oh my goodness, so many times. So if you see that information over and over repeatedly, it's just confirming your bias. Oh, this is true. The Western medicine is obviously wrong, therefore I'm losing trust in Western medicine. And
And if I could,
so
I'm sorry, go ahead.
please go ahead.
Oh, I just want to expand on what you're saying. So this is tricky. It's your experience was so true and so real, and often similar to what others have, in that you didn't have a great experience with Western medicine. They didn't take great care of you, didn't explain things thoroughly. The first rounds of treatments didn't make a big difference. So given that real experience, it's very easy then to be mistrustful of other things they say. So if they say other things like you have to watch the TSH, or it's easy to disregard them because you've already been burned by them.
Yes, and that's exactly what happened. I was just so obstinate, and I refused to believe them. And my doctor did, he did. He tried to convince me, but his style of communication and my inability to receive and hear him, because I had completely, my trust was eviscerated in Western medicine. I wasn't willing to listen. Because if I had listened, the logic in my mind was that I would have to make myself vulnerable to that first event that happened to me, which was the cystic acne, the weight gain. And who would be there to help me out of that jam? Certainly not Western medicine. So I clung to this myth, like for my dear life, that you don't dose by TSH, you dose by T3. And so my TSH got to be dangerously low, and my thyroid was really overacting. And I thought I was going crazy. It was just the like racing thoughts, and with no reprieve. It was physical anxiety. It was just the worst feeling. I took myself a number of times to the emergency. They did flag for me. They were like, "Oh, you seem to be okay," but they flagged for me that my TSH was really low, and maybe my doctor. This I kind of them off. I was like, whatever. So close brush, but I had this really horrific negative experience, and I still wasn't hearing them. my distrust of the Western medical system was that eroded, that I actually ended up kind of getting better, remaining on the same dose of 120 milligrams of desiccated thyroid. And I had the same thing happen to me the following year. And that's when it shook me. I was like, I cannot, my mental health is more important than whatever other things I'm afraid of. I can't stay on this medication, on this high medication any longer.
You were feeling anxious and hard to function, it sounds like. And
Yeah, I never really understood what it was more. Anxiousness doesn't seem like the right word. It seems too small.
mhm.
It was panic. It was like, it's as though I was experiencing imagine all of the low points that you've experienced and the high points over 10 years. I was experiencing that in 10 minutes.
Wow.
And it was just, the cycle was on repeat, and it was just, the thoughts were unrelenting. I couldn't stop them no matter what I did. So it was one of the most painful things I've been through. Yeah. And as soon as I started getting off the medication, it started to resolve itself.
A brief story you might appreciate. There was a gentleman I treated many years ago for Graves' disease. And as a career, he was a war photographer. So he was the guy who was like dodging bullets and taking pictures. And he told me once, I was asking him about his experience during severe hyperthyroidism. And he said that being at home, safe with his wife nearby, in the middle of a hyperthyroid storm, in the middle of the panic from that, he said that was scarier than being on the front line, dodging bullets and taking pictures. Like
I
almost getting
do.
killed, it was worse.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And it's like, I'm appreciative of people like yourself, who are doctors and who can share stories like that, and who have empathy and have compassion and have the right information. But it's also important the way you deliver that information. Like we forget that it's important for somebody to feel heard. And I know that I don't know you, and we only just recently met, but everything that all of the books that I read of yours, I felt very like, oh, this is a person I can actually trust. So, and I appreciate you sharing that story. It's crazy what the nervous system, I thought to myself, there's no worse experience than this. If I don't experience this ever again, I'm a very happy person. It takes very little to make me happy these days.
So was it a matter then of just coming down off of the higher mountains? Were there more stages to that, or?
Yeah. So successfully for 10 years, I was on 60 mg desiccated. And the advice that I received by going outside of Western medicine was through a fairly popular, I won't mention her name, but she's a very pronounced, like she's like the thyroid blogger. It was on her advice that I ended up increasing it to 120, doubling it. And it was, so when I started tapering off, I decreased it down to 60. And then my thyroid, for whatever's going on, I'm not entirely sure what's going on, but it needed to decrease even more. So I'm currently on 37.5.
To give some context for yourself and the listeners. So desiccated thyroid, if we were to think about that in terms of normal doses and body size, 1 grain dose. So I'll go in the terms you're using. So like 120 milligram dose, for example, the higher one. That's kind of a starting dose that someone might need if they're about 200 pounds. They had no thyroid. They might need about that much. But yeah, it's about a 60 milligram dose per 100 pounds of body weight is an approximate rule of thumb for natural thyroid, and that's for someone who has no thyroid output. So yeah, for you to have been on that high of a dose, to have known that showed your scores were too high, that all fits perfectly. That's like trying to put a grown-up in kid shoes. It just wouldn't fit. It just wouldn't be expected to fit. You just know there's going to be problems.
I mean, hearing you say that, the fact that it's a 200-pound grown man with no thyroid, and that's what I was taking.
Yeah. Well, and it's
That's
tough.
just crazy.
Yeah, and it's really tough because the view you mentioned, it's so pervasive in natural medicine. And the hard part too, there's a lot of complexity here. Part of it is the fact that you weren't served by conventional medicine and you were already mistrustful. That's so rational. The other part that's difficult is that they want to do well, and that in many cases, when someone does raise the dose a certain amount, they often do feel better at first. And there's this cycle that goes on to where when you take too much, your body resists that. So your body has a lot of ways to control thyroid hormones. The TSH is just one. It controls how much you release. But then after that, you've got dozens of ways that control how much stays in circulation and how quickly it leaves your body and how well you absorb it on your cells. So when there's too much, you're like bailing the ship out as fast as you can. And the paradox that many experience is that they can feel like there's too little, because their body's fighting it. It's there, but their body's resisting it. And they have symptoms like there's too little. And if they raise the dose, it takes a while before the body can start to catch up again. And so they have a window in which now it's like broken over the top, and now they are getting it, and they do feel better for a while. But then their body says, no, this isn't safe. The body's working harder. So what happens is they keep going through this cycle to where they raise the dose, they feel kind of better, and but then that goes away, and they keep repeating that until finally the side effects are unbearable. And finally, they can't stay on it anymore. And it's just causing obvious harm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is it possible that it just works for some people?
Well, this is the thing. So when you've got too much thyroid, in many cases, there are no symptoms. So many people don't have symptoms from too much. And we can talk about both in terms of taking too high of a dose of medicine and also mild hyperthyroidism. So in both cases, most people don't have any symptoms whatsoever. And yet, even though they don't have symptoms, they do have risks. There are complications that show up.
Oh, interesting. So you're saying it's the thyroid, that the hyper could be happening, but it's the symptoms are still, so the risks are still there, but you might not know that it's happening.
Right.
So am I correct to say that blood work is the only way?
Well, yeah, and here's the story. So the history of testing thyroid levels, a lot of stuff changed between 1970 and 1972. Before then, we had no way, we could only measure T4 and T3. We couldn't yet measure TSH. And what happens is that when you get too much, the T4 and T3 stay stable long before the TSH goes down, because it's kind of like how fast a duck is paddling. You can see the duck moving, but there might be a current. The duck is still moving. So you might have too much, but the body's getting rid of the extra. And so you still keep the right amounts of T3 and T4. In fact, sometimes they even dip down when you get too much. So yeah, so they're still stable. They're the last things to change because your body tries hard to keep them in a steady balance. One example is calcium in the bloodstream. People can consume too much or too little calcium, but their blood calcium never budges until their body can't regulate it. And that's the same with T3 and T4. They're the last things to change. So before 1970, we had these other blood tests, and the way that doses were given was based upon symptoms, based upon metabolic rate, and based upon blood levels of thyroid hormones. And for all those years between roughly 1920 to 1970, or 1930 to 1970, people with thyroid disease that were on treatment, they had a massive rate of death from heart disease. And no one knew why. People thought that it was just like an inevitable part of thyroid treatment. But then once they realized the role of the TSH, they saw, oh, wow, for all these years, a lot of these people were overdosed and we had no way of knowing. We could never tell that otherwise. Now, the drawback was that medicine took that way too far. And they said that we're not going to concern ourselves with symptoms or anything else. We're only going to concern with this broad range of TSH. And they wanted to do nothing else. And that was taking it too far. Now, thankfully, people weren't dying left and right from heart disease all the time. So it helped in that sense. But it took away that window of benefit, which was more narrow and more precise.
Right. So it was an overcorrection on the part of medicine. Okay. That's very interesting, and it totally makes sense. And I also think that when I was listening to your book, a lot of things that snapped into clear view for me were that, it's the endocrine system. And we're overlooking things like maybe liver function and adrenals and cortisol, and all of these things play a part in health of the thyroid. And for the longest time, because I got to be so severe with my diet, I got to as far as eliminating all the lectins. And I was not eating a lot of things. Like, I still have fear of certain types of foods, and I'm working on reintegrating those and kind of becoming, there's this term orthorexic,
Yeah.
obsessed with eating healthy. So I'm definitely trying to become a normal eater again. But what helped me a lot was in your book when you touted the benefits of legumes and beans. And I hadn't thought of even those were just a no. They were a hard no for me, but I started eating them again, and I'm still here. So
I went down that road too myself, for sure. It's easy to do that. There's so many ways in which you want to do right by your body and your health. And there's so many ways in which it seems like people talk about foods as being bad or being dangerous. And that by itself can be a pitfall. Yeah, that's a tricky thing. Yeah, do you know that plant foods, that every single plant food contains lectins, that there are no lectin-free foods. And in
no,
fact,
I
your
didn't know that.
body,
Really?
animal cells make lectins too. There's no lectin-free cells.
Wow. Okay.
So we
You know,
we can't avoid them.
yeah, and it got me thinking too about, like, when the relationship we have with food, my negative relationship with food, it caused me so much stress. And I bet that affected my health to a degree, right? It's the constant pressure of the allostatic load of just like constant high running emotions and challenging emotions that are creating that wear and tear on the body. So yeah, that adds to it, this fear of food, and it's just marketing, right? Like, we see it everywhere, where it's be scared of this, be scared of that.
Your cells, the media story was that if it bleeds, it leads. The scary things get our attention. But I
Yes.
think about this. This is a journey. I mean, what happened to you? You were a healthy young gal, minding your own business, having a fun life, and this thing struck you through no fault of your own. And I think about all the people to where there are those that even the most basic steps do help. It's not everyone by any means, but there are some people to where they just go on basic medication, they feel better, and that's it. That's probably the minority of people. But then there's many people that will take it further, and they'll do some natural treatments, and that'll help them safely and effectively. But there are so many to where both sides aren't helpful or aren't safe. And that's why I'm just so passionate about, I'm so thankful to have you talk about your story. I'm so passionate to share this message, because you can get better. There are safe ways to go, and you don't have to be ignored, and you don't have to be overtreated unsafely. And yeah, I just really want this to go better for people.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for doing this. I really attribute the fact that I'm not currently dead somewhere to the fact that I read your book, because it gave me the opportunity to feel safe. Because there was going to be no way that I trusted Western medicine to say, oh, you've got to decrease your medication. But it was when I read your book, and when I listened to it on Audible, but when I heard you say that, TSH is actually very much part of the picture, I was like, oh, okay. Oops.
It's so tempting to say it's not relevant, or it's over focused on, and throw it out completely. But it's nuance. It's like, yeah, it's not all that matters. And this one broad range is not all that matters, but we can't ignore it either. It's a signal that talks to the thyroid, but it does a lot besides that. There's so much overlap between what hormone signals do in the body. It also tells the heart muscle to regrow itself. It tells bones to repair. It tells brain cells to regrow. So we need TSH for a lot of reasons. And I've heard some of the people who talk about ignoring the TSH say that once you have enough thyroid hormone, your body has no need for TSH, that it does nothing else. And yeah, anyone can take any time looking at what we know about in endocrinology and physiology textbooks. That's just not true. It does a lot of important things in the body.
Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate you so much, because even as you're talking, I'm listening and you're able to provide balance, right? Like if we're getting specific on the problem with Western medicine that alienates people, is that it's just the doctor says, no, this is how it is. And they don't do a lot of explaining, but you're able to say like, oh, this is the historical background and this is what's happening on both sides. And so it becomes persuasive out of trust building, as opposed to somebody just ordering you what to do because they know better. So thank you.
Well, I'm also excited to hear now that you're needing less and less and less, because what you're taking now probably represents maybe a third or a quarter of what your body requires. And so from that, we can infer that you're making 2/3 or 3/4 of what you require. So even given all that, your thyroid is not quit.
Yes, and that's really exciting news. And I'm hoping too that, because I did make a lot of lifestyle modifications, I'm still off of certain types of salt. So I only do the gray French salt, on your recommendation as well. It either has lower iodine or no iodine, if I'm correct, right? And I eat legumes now, and it's just a much healthier lifestyle. And I, I feel like that has to be part of the picture, part of why it's kind of improving.
Just to throw this out, if it's of use to you as well, there are times to where when someone's thyroid gets stronger, that their TSH creeps down and says, yeah, this is just too much. That totally happens. But they've had a lot of studies on the idea of how often thyroid disease reverses itself. You had such dramatic symptoms, your levels were probably obvious. I don't doubt that it was overt hypothyroidism, but we now know that about a third of people, even if they do nothing at all special, that it just goes away when it's overt disease. So doing smart things like taking care of yourself, eating well, getting the micronutrients you need, those things only raise those odds. So you already are seeing a good amount of your function back again. That's apparent from what your scores are. So the question is the only way that your thyroid gets better by it showing that your medicine is too much? And many people who don't need medication, they still have levels suggesting that they need it. What happens is that if you take a little bit, your body slows down by that much and then some. So many people who successfully deprescribe, they do so even when they don't have a low TSH. They still can go through a taper process, and many find they don't need medication. But yeah, you're on a small amount. You've come a long ways, and I think you've only got more good things to come.
Okay. So just to make sure that I understand you correctly, that people still continue to deprescribe and go a little bit lower on their medication, but it's often not evident through blood work. It's maybe based on how you feel.
Well, so I guess what I'm saying is long term, your blood levels, of course, matter. But as far as deciding when someone works with their doctor and decides whether or not they wish to deprescribe, some people have a normal or even a high normal TSH, and yet they can still successfully deprescribe.
Oh,
Now,
interesting.
yeah. Now, if someone has a low TSH, you're right. That clearly means they're getting more than they need. But many people, if they are making some, and if there are certain criteria that are present, like they've got a thyroid, for example, they can successfully taper a dosage, even if going into the taper, they don't have a low TSH level.
Okay, interesting. And would that be the case if, for example, the TSH is low, within range, but quite low, but the T3 and T4 are also on the low end of the range?
I'm really glad you asked that. Yes. So what happens is that the TSH, the T3 and T4, let's put them on here. Now, the story is that they're on a seesaw. One gets high, the other gets low. That's what they teach us in medical school. And I wrote that in my first few books. I quit saying that because it's misleading. The seesaw thing is only true at the extremes. So if when you were on that 120 milligram dose, you may have had normal levels of T3 that may not have been elevated. But if you would have taken 10, yeah. But if you would have taken 10 times that dose, your T3 would have been high. So at the extremes. Now, on the other end of the extremes, if someone didn't have a thyroid and they were on no medication, over the course of about 2 to 3 months, they would have their TSH would shoot up first, but over the course of several months, their T3 and T4 would drop off. So then they would fit inverse. But besides those extremes, they're almost never inverse. So a really common thing to have happen when you're getting too much thyroid, again, your body fights it. Your body is dumping it faster. So it's quite common to have low levels of T3 and T4 in that situation. And many in natural medicine say, oh, there's a problem with the pituitary, whatever else. No, it's a normal adaptation. But then the other perspective to bear in mind is that, where should T3 and T4 levels be? Where are they in healthy people? As a generalization, healthy people don't have high T3 and high T4. Those that have the highest T3 levels tend to have more disease risks and more weight problems. So yeah, they don't have to be high. And it's quite normal, even if you're getting too much, that they're going to be on the low side.
It's mind-boggling to me to hear you say that. I just think back of all of the articles I read that are published on naturopaths' websites where they talk about, your should be in upper of the and hearing you say that that's actually not the case. It just makes me sad. It makes me sad that's, and I wonder, is there an attribution? Can you attribute that myth to something? Because it was hard to find, your information in all of this information. Like, we live in the information age. There's so much being published. You don't know who to trust. I'm so happy that I found you, and I recommend you to everyone. But how did this myth start?
Yeah, I do know where it started. I also know what it means. And based upon a really superficial understanding of that whole seesaw, so healthy people generally have a low normal TSH. That's totally true. And so if you assumed that TSH and T3 were always on a seesaw, and healthy people have a low TSH, you could then assume that therefore they should have a high T3. You could make that assumption. But one way you could determine where T3 should be is you could just guess and say, oh yeah, it should be here. But the other way is you could say, well, what happens to people who are healthy? Where are their T3 levels? Or of people with thyroid disease, of those who have high, normal, or low, what are the health differences long term? And so if you look at it in those ways, you see that, oh no, it's not this seesaw thing after all. There's actually quite a range that's okay. And when someone's on medication, pretty much the only way they ever have high levels of T3 is when they're massively overdosed, because otherwise the body is trying to fight it and get rid of it. When you're taking medication, it's a whole different ballgame than when your body is working by itself. Even if it's the same hormones, it's a different situation. Your body fights it more so unless it's very necessary.
Yeah, I can substantiate that with my own experience that my T3 and T4 have never been high. They've been within the reference range, but they've never been, the only time my T3 was out of reference range was when I was over medicated. But all the times that I'm feeling really amazing, it's at the lower end of the range, and both of them are pretty close. Both T4 and T3 are pretty close at the end of the reference range, not at the high end, at the low end.
That's where healthy people tend to be. That's more typical.
Yay.
So yeah, thank you again for sharing the story. I think this will be very instructive for people. And if there was anything that was useful that you got out of it, then that's great. I hope that was the case.
I did. Yes. I think this, what you just shared about, because it was stressing me out a little bit. I would sometimes look at my tests and I would say, oh, I'm towards the bottom range for my T3. And I would kind of have a little moment of panic and I'd have to kind of talk myself off. So this is kind of a huge discovery for me that, so thank you.
Something that's been surprising is that T3 levels consistently being high are risk factors for breast cancer and also risk factors for diabetes. So even within the normal range. So it's not only not desirable, it's actually unhealthy to be there.
Wow. I wonder if I can ask you the question,
Sure, sure.
is there a relationship? And just it's kind of percolating what you're saying about the body managing out the hormone levels to make sure that you're okay and you're not going into hyperthyroid mode. Is it possible that your body is excreting it through urine and therefore making you go to the bathroom more?
Also, it changes renal function and it changes urinary frequency. Now, to be really precise, that's not an adaptive mechanism for clearing T3, but when T3 levels are higher, that does increase glomerular filtration rate. So you do generate more urine. So yeah, so
Okay.
you do pee more as you start to get hyperthyroid.
Wow. Okay. This all makes so much sense because again, when you don't have the context, which is I am in the category of people who don't have context, and I'm kind of functioning on, oh, this symptoms can mean A, B, and C, and you kind of panic about it. So I was, the things that you read online, which was like, oh, it could be diabetes or it could be a nervous system disorder. But it could also be something that's more obvious, like I'm peeing more because
I've done some consults as of late, and a huge percent of people that I talk to are in a situation like you were in to some degree. They're often over medicated. I've heard it said that over 80% of people who are in functional medicine practices are on thyroid medication. And I don't know numbers of how many are over medicated, but it's common. Of those who see me, it's the majority. And often they have so many odd symptoms they're chasing, and many are just classic hyperthyroid symptoms. That's another example of that.
yes, yes, you're so right. It is a symptom chasing situation, and they're odd symptoms and they don't add up to anything that makes sense, at least to somebody who's a lay person like me.
Just one last point along this thread. One of the more common ones, a big study was done looking at the relationship between thyroid hormones and body weight. And yes, definitely there are those where they're completely low that have massive unexplained weight gain like you did. But when you look at people who are medicated and you look at those who are getting too much and getting too little, the people getting too much are 3 times more likely to have weight problems than those who are getting too little. So yeah, so weight gain is a very common complication from too much thyroid hormone.
What?
Yeah. Now, if someone massively
Oh,
overdoses, they will lose scale weight. They won't lose fat, they'll lose muscle and bone. So if they massively overdose, they lose scale weight. But in most cases, being mildly overdosed means fat gain.
I'm shocked. It's so antithetical to what general logic would indicate. But again, I find comfort in that. Yeah, thank you.
You're doing the right thing. You're in a much better place. And I'm so happy how it's turned out for you. And again, I'm very thankful you could share the story because I think there's others that will learn from that and move to a safer position.
Yeah, me too. And thank you so much for having me on and allowing me to share the story. Yeah, hopefully it does help many people. And yeah,
All right, Marta, appreciate your time, and everyone here, thank you for joining us. And I'll be back with you soon for another episode of Medical Myths, Legends, and Fairy Tales. Take good care. Bye-bye. Hey, Dr. Christianson here. Thanks so much for joining me for another episode. Is there a topic you'd like me to cover? I'd love to hear from you. Just go to Dr. Alan Christianson on Facebook or Instagram, write your question, and use the hashtag Medical Myths. Did you find this show helpful? If so, please take a minute and leave us a rating on iTunes so that others can know. Thanks much, and I'll be back with you real soon. Bye-bye.